to another episode of Q&A. Our question for this video is, should women be allowed to preach?
So this is a short but loaded question. And so this is clearly a divisive thing. There's a lot of thoughts and opinions on it. We want to try to make sure that we're anchored from a scriptural perspective. I'd say our goal in all of these things, that whether it's these Q&As or however we approach scripture, is to figure out how we best honor and glorify God, and that we don't try to dig into scripture so that we can either loosen our boundaries or so that we can tighten the noose, but rather just understand what is God calling us into and what is His will and how do we best resemble His family. And so we want to make sure that we're anchored on scripture in these topics, and especially on something like this, which is not a topic of salvation, right? This is not a topic about if I agree or disagree, then therefore I can or can't be saved. This has nothing to do with salvation. This has everything to do with how do we best understand God and His will for us as we follow Him.
So let's start with what Scripture says on the topic.
Yeah, so 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 12 is the text that is gone to most often regarding this. There's a few others, but this is the one that's the clearest. And in it, Paul writes, "I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man." That's pretty clear, right? I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. And it seems pretty obvious. Now there's questions that come with that. First, is it cultural, right? Was this just something in their time that isn't relevant anymore today? Is this a matter of when they say that a woman can't teach, what does it mean to teach? Teach what? Teach how often? Teach on which topics? Or have authority over? What does it mean to have authority over a man? What does it refer to? A role, position, teaching from the pulpit? What do all these things mean? And I think trying to understand the particulars will help us engage. One thing that I want to make sure that we anchor on when we talk about this topic being divisive is that normally people address this more as, can a woman preach? And that word's wrong, right? This isn't a question of can a woman preach. In fact, we'll get to it when I quote a professor later on in this topic. But it's not about whether a woman can preach. In fact, I appreciate how the question was asked, should a woman be allowed to preach, right? This isn't about competency or ability. And I think usually that's where this topic devolves to. When you get into conversations about men and women, it becomes, well, you think that women aren't good enough or that they're not competent. Nothing to do with that. This is about truly understanding what Scripture teaches.
So if it's not about competency or ability, what is the thought behind women not preaching?
So we have to go to the full text. When we read from 1 Timothy chapter 2, I want to read from 11 to verse 14, so we can really understand what Paul is talking about. And so starting in verse 11, he says, "Let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor." And so we don't like these ideas of submissiveness or let a woman remain quiet. Or Paul's saying that these are qualities that a woman is exerting on her own, meaning that she has the authority and she has the power in this situation to do this. It's not about telling them to be quiet. It's about a woman saying, okay, at this point, this is my time to learn. But what Paul is really getting to is not just this idea of a woman being quiet or a woman not teaching or preaching. He's talking about created order. He uses the words where he says that Adam was formed first, then Eve. Why is that important in this topic? That Adam was formed first, then Eve. He's referring back to created order. And then he goes on to say that it was Eve who sinned first, then Adam, saying that the order was corrupted, that Eve sinned, and instead of Adam taking on his spiritual leadership role, he failed, right? And because he sinned next. And so the order was destroyed. Adam was not just complicit, he failed in his spiritual leadership role. And so what Paul is really referring to here is this idea of order in the created order, rather than simply talking about whether a woman can preach or not. In fact, we look in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 22 to 33, which I won't read it all, but Paul in that text is laying out the order of the family, talking about the man who is leading, first submissive to Christ, but who is leading the family, the woman submissive to the man, and it's this willing submissiveness that we're being in peaceful accord with each other, understanding there's a created order. In fact, we know that Christ is the head of the church and God is the head of Christ. With Christ as the head of the church is the family of God. So if God is the head and Christ is submissive to God, and the church is submissive to Christ, and man is the head of the church, the man has to be submissive to Christ, woman submissive to man. It's about this order. We're all submissive, right? We're all submitting, and we're all submitting back to Christ. And so it's about this created order in saying that God and his divine purposes made it so that this is Christ's church, he is the head, and that there's male leadership given within the church, and that the women will continue to learn and be a fully integrated, functioning part of the body, just in different ways outside the pulpit.
So then does a woman preaching to a man contradict the created order?
And this debate really comes down to how you see preaching, right? Well, what do we see when Paul says that a woman shouldn't teach? Does he mean preaching? And so I'd like to read two verses that frame up, for me, my thought on what preaching is. And so first is Titus chapter 2:15, which says, "These then are the things you should teach. Encourage and rebuke with all authority." Now, Paul had been trying to teach Titus what it meant to lead a church, to be a pastor over a church. And he's saying that you should teach and encourage and rebuke with all authority. And then in 2 Timothy 3, verses 16 to 17, he says, "All scripture is God-breathed and is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness, so that the servant of God may be thoroughly equipped for every good work." So preaching is very much teaching, and it's teaching with authority, which Paul, in the scripture we read from 1 Timothy chapter 2, clearly says a woman should not teach or have authority over men, and preaching is exactly teaching with authority. And so it's that is how I see this message, is that Paul is saying that shouldn't happen. And again, it's not an issue of whether or not a woman can. In fact, we see in scripture back in Acts 18, verses 24 to 26, and again in Titus 2:3. Titus 2:3 is saying that a woman should teach what is good. And also in Acts chapter 18, Luke there is talking about how Priscilla and Aquila, really led by Priscilla, takes Apollos, who is a preacher, and pulls him to the side and teaches him all about Jesus. So you think about this, a woman's taking the lead there, but she's doing it in a particular way. So it's not that they're not capable or able, it's that whether or not they should. And I do think that scripturally it's against the created order, considering that preaching is about teaching with authority, which is the two things Paul says that a woman shouldn't do.
So are there instances other than formal preaching where a woman can teach to men or to mixed audiences?
Yes, I would definitively say yes. I think that anywhere because what we're really talking about is in roles that are church father roles are the places where the woman shouldn't be when we're talking about leadership and authority. But in terms of fully integrated into the body and even in certain ways teaching, yes, absolutely. I mean, I want to read a quote from Mary Cassian, who's a professor at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And she says this, "I do this joyfully. I am not a church father. I am a woman and therefore a spiritual mom. I delight in the fact that God has created us male and female and wired us to be spiritual dads and moms. Arguably, because I am a gifted teacher, I could do a better job of interpreting the text and delivering the sermon than many church fathers do. But that would miss the point. It's not about competence. God created the family, and in the family, men are supposed to be the dads and women are supposed to be the moms. It's not a question of who is better at it or more gifted. Male-female roles are neither identical nor interchangeable." We'll post under this video the link to that article because she does a really good job of laying out why it's not about competence or ability or even what we feel or desire, because she's very gifted. If you read some of her blogs and books, very gifted teacher, but she understands it's about created order, not about ability or competence. But within our catalyst groups here at the church, our small groups, the group that I'm in, I don't lead a group, I'm in a group, and there's one man who leads it and a woman who co-leads it with him, and there's weeks where she teaches and leads. I have no problem with that. I think that we learn a lot from each other. I don't sit under that authority, but yet I learn a lot together with the group, and she teaches very well biblically and spiritually and practically. We look at seminars, right? You go to a parenting or marriage seminar, wonderful opportunity for women to present scriptural background for how do we practically live to both men and women. I have no issue with that. Training programs, I've got blogs, books, all of those things I think are completely fine. Where we get to areas of concern are where women are elevated to this idea of church father, where they're elevated to a position of authority over a man, in a consistent format where they're seen, especially from the pulpit, where to be the authority, the teaching authority, to teach with authority, I see that as where we get into problems. So I would say that is where it breaks the order and contradicts what God's desire is for His church.
Thank you.
We hope that you find these Q&As helpful and as a good resource for your understanding of Scripture. We want to make sure that we understand that our lives should be fed by the truth of Scripture. And so if you have questions, if there's things that we can help answer both from a theological perspective or from a life application question, please submit your questions. We would love to be able to help, because if you have that question, likely others do too. Thank you.